Welcome. My name is John O Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and this podcast is the latest in a series under the title The Danube Dialogues. It's on the full range of issues in public debate. Our guest on this occasion is Michael Anton, a distinguished academic, political theorist, a former national security officer in the United States government, and most significantly for our purposes today, the author of a new book, The Stakes, that has just been published in the run-up to the November presidential election in the United States. Michael, welcome to Danube Dialogues. Michael, I suspect we'll be discussing mainly your book and the election in the next 50 minutes, but I would like to begin by talking about some of the things you've done in life and how you reached your present opinions. That's necessary because not all the information about you in the public arena is fair and unbiased. Here, for example, is one of the opening sentences in your Wikipedia profile. Michael Anton is an American former national security official in the Trump administration. He is best known for his right-wing views, his conspiracy theory orientation, and his pseudonymous essays written during the 2016 presidential campaign, in which he supported Donald Trump and collaborated on the pro-Trump Journal of American Greatness blog. I like the use of the word collaborated there rather than merely wrote. What's your comment on that description?
I've actually never read my wiki page. I figure it would just irritate me. So I hadn't heard that. I don't know in what conspiracy theory I believe in. I suppose it's of the one piece that I wrote recently called The Coming Coup, in which all I do is quote a bunch of Democrats saying we're going to make sure that Joe Biden is the president, whatever the outcome of the election. So if that's a conspiracy theory, it's their theory. It's actually not even their theory. It's their stated plan. This is something I talk about in the book that I came up with a term for, which has yet to catch on and may never catch on because it's a little bit wordy or a little bit complex, but I call it the celebration parallax. A parallax is a phenomena, the same fact pattern or phenomena appears different depending on the angle of viewing. So if the Democrats all say, if Joe Biden loses, we're going to challenge every vote and ask Democratic governors to send Democratic electors to the Electoral College, even if Trump won that state. If they say that, that's A-OK, fine. That's democracy because democracy is the right outcome. But if I say they're saying this, if I point out the same fact pattern, I'm a conspiracy theorist and it's not happening. To me, the ultimate example of the celebration parallax is demographic change leading to electoral change. So when the Democrats and liberals say mass immigration tips the United States leftward and toward the Democratic Party and toward a permanent Democratic majority, that's great because it's understood that they are celebrating that fact, therefore they are allowed to acknowledge it. If a Republican or a conservative says exactly the same thing, demographic change tips America leftward, it's a conspiracy theory, it's not happening, and you're a racist for saying it. Same identical fact pattern, the only difference is whether you approve of it or disapprove of it. And not even disapprove. To be caught in the celebration parallax is simply enough not to celebrate. So you can mention the fact pattern in a neutral way and just say, so you say this is happening. People will say conspiracy theorist, not happening. This has been going on immigration. This has been going on for a very, very, very long time. And one thing I've noticed is that once the inevitable has happened. So in California, it used to be no, total lie that this is having any effect at all. Once it got to the point in California where the Republicans had no chance, they were just demographically overwhelmed, and California was a one-party state. Then media organs like the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle all came out and said, yippee, isn't it great that demographic change has finally made Republicans irrelevant? This was said to be a conspiracy theory and a lie for years until it was fully in place and irreversible, and then it's something to whoop for joy about.
As a matter of fact, that your celebration parallax, which is a difficult phrase to catch on, is very similar, of course, to going back to the 1930s, the concept of the open conspiracy, in which people would say openly that they were planning to bring about the collapse of a particular society. When someone said, well, isn't that a bit objectionable? I mean, as you're saying, others would say, oh, come on, how can you believe this? After all, the fact that it was all said in public was, in a sense, a disguise for the fact that it was being said at all. Let me now turn to the reality of your life, because you've worked in finance, you've been in the US government, you've been a speechwriter, and you've worked in academic life as a student of political ideas. Let's start with college. How did you move to the political ideas we associate you with? Who were your principal teachers? How would you describe your broad philosophy and how it developed?
Well, initially I moved in that direction by the simple expedient of going off to Berkeley in 1987, which is a large public university in the state of California. And, you know, I wasn't thinking politically. It was I was a resident of California. It's a prestigious public university. It was also very cheap in those days, fairly close to home. So it made sense to go there. And I went, and they were very left wing, and I reacted against that initially. A few years later, I found Claremont, the Claremont Graduate School in Southern California, where I met and learned for years from, I mean, there's too many to name. They're all named in the preface to the book, but Harry Jaffa, Charles Kessler, Larry Arnn, Tom West, you know, all these people associated with the Claremont Institute were my real teachers, I think. And that's where I got my undergirding philosophy, which I have not changed. At least I feel I have not changed it. Many have accused me of I must have changed because a real, you know, Claremont person couldn't possibly support Donald Trump, except that most of us, not all of us, but most of us did. And so we're accused by various concern trolls of having betrayed our principles when we don't, and I certainly don't see it that way.
My impression is that your interests are very substantially in the classical political philosophers, in particular Aristotle. Let me ask the simple-minded question. What exactly do you think Aristotle has got to give us in the very different age in which we live more than 2,000 years after he wrote?
Well, one particularly apt lesson is in his Politics. He talks about the need for a balanced or mixed constitution. He says that there will always be these differing elements in any city or body politic or state, the one, the many, and the few, the rich, the poor, the powerful, the powerless, et cetera. And each faction always, by nature, tries to rule unopposed, tries to rule for its own private good and neglect the interests of other factions. And so a decent and working and long-lived constitution has to balance the interests of all of these factions, which is something that the American founders tried to do with the claims of monarchy, or the necessity for dispatch and executive decision is vested in a presidency. The interests of the few and of refined deliberation are in a Senate. The House of Representatives represents the people. The judiciary takes certain issues and removes them from, or at least insulates them from political, the weather vane of political factionalism. All of these things are intended to balance these inherent elements of any regime. What we have gotten to, and what I think provoked the Trump reaction, was a kind of oligarchic America where one faction within the society, in particular coastal information age managerial elites and techies and bankers and so on, rule. They thought unopposed. And I think some of them may even believe they're doing it for the common good, although I don't believe that. I think they rule for their private good. And they ignored the concerns of the middle of the country. If you want to say the bottom, not the bottom half, because the very bottom of society are allied with them. It's a kind of a high-low coalition against the middle. And they ignored it and kind of thought that they had overcome it, and were shocked that portion of the electorate and of the body politic rose up and rebelled against them with the Trump election. And I think Aristotle would have, if they had paid attention, would have told them, you're going to provoke this reaction if you keep going the way you're going.
Let me put a question that is addressed to the theory of mixed government in its own terms, but which it seems to me reveals a flaw. As a matter of fact, I was reading Irving Kristol about this just yesterday. And that is this. The theory is that, among other things, that democracy will be restrained by those institutions which represent the wisdom of other groups in society. This means that there will not be The mob will not be allowed to run rampage, but institutions like the courts will stand there as a way of persuading them, or an upper house persuading them to think again. Now, that's plausible in its own terms, except that at the moment it seems to most of conservatives, I think, that wisdom is much more evident in ordinary people, and that it is the institutions designed to restrain them which are in fact off on some weird utopian rampage every other day.
Well, that's true now, but that's not always true. I mean, there are times when, if you read something like Thucydides, when an assembly can make very terrible decisions that need to be checked by some, a wiser, cooler head, above them, let us say, on the social ladder. So what we have now, because of the concentration of oligarchic power, anybody who rules effectively unopposed and who never hears their views challenged tends to just radicalize what they already believed or wanted to believe, and that's what happened in the United States. I think coastal elites, the bigwigs in San Francisco and Manhattan, got used to getting their way on everything and got used to not ever even accepting the notion that there might be a just claim from down below that they're ignoring. Then they became insular and out of touch. Now that trend could easily be reversed. You could, if Aristotle were here, he might say, all right, let's suppose that the Trump revolution, whatever you want to call it, works. The people regain a semblance of the government, and kind of populist government reforms our institutions for 10 or 20 years. You could get to a point where the people become insular and stop listening to, they stop hearing serious critiques of their own excesses. And some elites are saying, wait a minute, slow down, stop. What about this? What about this? And they don't listen, and they lead into some kind of disaster or problem. That could easily happen. But if this is a cycle, as Aristotle implies, right, we're in the other spectrum of the cycle right now, where the people are the ones who haven't been heard, and it's the elites who have their fingers in their ears not listening.
Well, I think we're going to be coming back to these points when we look at your book. But just continuing a bit, you also have become associated, in my mind at least, with a particular modern political philosopher, one Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, that name is enough to arouse enormous fears and suspicions, not just on the left. What is it about Machiavelli that, in your view, makes him important to us?
Well, I'm a follower of Leo Strauss on this point, in which he argues that Machiavelli is the founder of modernity, philosophic modernity. So to understand how the world today differs from the classical world, he's the best guide. I also think, as Harvey Mansfield put it once, that while philosophy is lurking behind the scenes in all of Machiavelli's works, the surface of his works is purely about politics in the here and now. There's no more purely political philosopher. So if you want to understand how actual day-to-day real-world politics works without reference, the grand theories are in there, kind of subsumed in layers of metaphor. But the surface is just, if you want to understand the nuts and bolts of how politics works, he's your guide. And then the third point I would say is no other political philosopher, bar none, whether ancient or modern. I guess the only potential rival here would be Thucydides. Is so deeply considers questions and concepts in war, peace, international relations, diplomacy, and foreign policy. So in those three respects, I think I have found him to be indispensable. And beyond that, I mean, I just find him fun to read. I mean, ultimately, you read these people because you're getting something out of it, and I find him can be completely fascinating. Yes, I'm well aware, and when I teach him, as I did last week, and I will this week, I point out to my students how radical he is at points, and even Strauss uses the word evil. I mean, you can't excuse some of the really, really horrible things that he says in his books, but it doesn't mean that you can dismiss him. I think it's unwise to dismiss him, but you also just need to be aware of what he's talking about and not make cheap excuses.
So in other words, if he's examining a course of action that whenever it's occurred before has always succeeded, he tells you about it, really not bothering too much about whether or not it seems to be wrong or to have really adverse consequences for other people.
He actually, I think, is slightly even more radical than that. He seems to say that, yes, right and wrong are real, but if you want to succeed, you have to be willing to do wrong. Not don't care, but openly enter into wrong. Otherwise, you will fail. You don't have to be wrong all the time. I mean, he often warns against, or he warns by example. So he'll give you the examples of tyrants who just went on crazy, bloodthirsty rampages and came to a bad end. He's not. And others have made this point. Other scholars have made the point that sometimes he seems to want to goad the imprudent tyrant into going too far, so that the guy will ruin himself and get killed and get sort of expunged from the political arena. His message to the judicious ruler is, if you try to be good all the time, you'll end up ruined and you won't be able to accomplish any good. If you actually want to accomplish good in the world, you're going to have to be willing to do wrong, to do evil. So it's not quite an ends justify the means in all circumstances. It's more an exhortation to the character of the prince or to somebody in the political arena that you can't play nice 100% of the time, or you will fail and your project will fail. Was it
Machiavelli himself or one of his disciples who coined the epigram, "Never wound a man except fatally"?
Well, he doesn't exactly say that, but he does say in Prince 3 that men should either be caressed or eliminated. He also says that the only type of injury one should do is one from which one cannot fear revenge.
Well, thanks. Before we leave your thank you. Before we leave your scholarly experience and work, I have one final question here. You mentioned Harry Jaffa a moment ago, and on other occasions you've mentioned Leo Strauss as great teachers. What did they, Jaffa in particular, contribute to your thought through his teaching?
Well, Strauss died when I was 3, but I've read all his books numerous times. Jaffa was a direct student of Strauss for 7 years, took every class, sat in every lecture Strauss did, and then I got to spend 3 years with Jaffa. So from Jaffa, first and foremost, he helped me understand Strauss's writings and also the books that Strauss interprets. But Jaffa was fundamentally and primarily, he learned all of the classics, Aristotle, Plato, the moderns, the ancients, from Strauss, but then spent most of his scholarly body of work was focused on America, was focused on the American Revolution, in particular, Abraham Lincoln above all, and in questions of constitutional interpretation. So I learned from him really how to think about the American Revolution, how to think about the American founding, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, how to put those events in the context, into the framework that Strauss set, how to see the difference between the ancient world and modernity, and how those changes necessitated the founders' regime the way it is, and how to see the consistency between what the founders were trying to do and what the classics recommend, but also how the differences between what the founders were trying to do and what the classics recommend are, in a sense, forced on them by necessity. So there's a gulf in the Straussian world, which I think is maybe smaller than it used to be, but has not gone away, that says America is a wholly modern regime and therefore defective on the classical or Straussian terms. And Jaffa fought against that and said, it's a modern regime because it has to be. It's a regime built in modern times. It has to come to terms with the Roman conquest of the ancient world, the end of the polis, the advent of Christianity, the separation of civil and religious law, and then the multiplication of Christian sects. It has to come to terms with that. But he also pointed out all the ways in which the founders acted in a kind of continuity with, if not the letter of Aristotle, the principle of Aristotle's politics. Jaffa used to teach that of the two great Aristotelian books, I mean, there's more than two, but the two that stick out for us, the ethics and the politics. From the politics, you can only learn principles. You can't learn recipes to apply to your time because the times are so different. The political circumstances are different. But the ethics, Jaffa would say, was essentially a perfect book that requires no updates and no edits. If you read the ethics and live your life according to that of Aristotle's teaching, you will be a good man.
And it was Jaffa, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, who saw the direct line of argument from the Declaration of Independence to Abraham Lincoln and to his Gettysburg Address and so on. And the significance of that is what exactly? It seems is the significance that there was in the American Declaration and later embodied in the Constitution an acceptance that since all men were created equal, even if that was not achievable at a particular point in history, there is in the Constitution and in the American vision a sense of steady movement, of gradual improvement. Is that correct or not?
Well, it's partly. I would say, first of all, Jaffa had a change of heart, or when he wrote his most famous book, *Crisis of the House Divided* in 1958, he argues that Lincoln transforms the founding. That the founding, he's more of that old school Straussian view that the founding is flawed, the founding is modern, it's narrow, and the founders, it's a sort of low but solid regime based on acquisition and just the protection of property and human passions, the satisfaction of passions. And then Lincoln ennobles and transforms and elevates it. Later in life, beginning about a decade later, and culminating by around the mid-70s, Jaffa comes to the conclusion that he was wrong, and that everything Lincoln found in the founding was present in the founding, that Lincoln changed nothing, but vindicated what had been already there. So when you say a movement toward, it's not a historical movement. The way Jaffa liked to quote one of Lincoln's speeches in which he talks about the Declaration as a standard maxim that the founders knew could not fully implement at the moment of the founding, but also knew that there was no reason to put no necessary reason to put these theoretical truths in the document. As I have put it, in a sense, you could interpret the Declaration as a Dear John letter. You know, those letters where you're breaking up with somebody, but you don't want to do it face to face, and so you write them. It's a Dear John letter to King, or Dear George letter to King George. We're leaving, and they don't have to. All they have to say is we're leaving, and maybe they can list the 18 charges against the king because these are all the things you've done that irritate us. They don't have to state a metaphysical theoretical basis for their action. Just saying we're going would have been enough. And if you need to say more, you could say because you have done X and Y and Z. But they want to say, why are these terrible things you've done wrong? We're going to tell you the theoretical basis why we think they're wrong. And that theoretical basis becomes the basis of the political legitimacy of our new regime. And they knew full well that having stated that, the practice of slavery in particular was incompatible and could not stand, but they had no means of getting rid of slavery at the time. I mean, just a couple of little details. For instance, the founders, as evidence that they knew this was wrong, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is enacted the same year as the Constitution, is drafted. This governs the territories of what becomes the Midwest and the Upper Midwest, so Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, and most of Minnesota, which is land that the United States wins by treaty in the Revolutionary War from Britain. The Northwest Ordinance says slavery will not be tolerated in any of the states that emerge from this territory. So even right then, they're cutting it off. They put a clause in the Constitution that enables Congress to stop the slave trade 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And when that turned out to be 1808, and the instant 1808 came along, Congress immediately passed a law outlawing the slave trade. There's a lot of other things that Jaffa pointed out as fulfillments of this initial promise that took time, but were essentially intended from the beginning.
Now, much of your life has, in fact, been spent outside academia. You worked in finance in a high-level position at a time of great revolutionary upheaval in financial innovation. I wonder, with great failures as well as great successes, I wonder what lessons you drew from your time in finance.
Well, it's hard to talk about just in that many of the people that I worked with, I'm still friendly with, and they treated me well. I could see that by 2016, I didn't want to be long-term there anymore, that my opinions and the opinions of my peers and colleagues were drifting in fundamentally different directions. And, to put it as simply as I can, Blue America was just getting bluer and bluer in its outlook and its sort of disdain for Middle America and its insularity. Whereas I'm a Blue American. I grew up in Northern California. I only went to coastal schools. I have all of their kind of habits and tastes, but in terms of my opinions, they kept drifting more red. Not necessarily to say right wing. In fact, I think in many ways they've become more centrist or moderate. I'm much more willing to use the law and state power to influence the economy in ways that a free market absolutist would say is unconservative, as long as I think those influences help the middle America, the middle class, the Rust Belt, the manufacturing areas and things like that. But I just felt increasingly out of place in Manhattan and on the coasts and in corporate America generally, which, I was ahead of the curve a little bit. If you look at what corporate America is doing now, this explosion of crazy wokeness in the year 2020, and it's frankly become more and more openly just anti-white. So like they're saying, well, we're going to make sure that we purge our management. We're going to try to get rid of people and only hire on a frankly racial basis, which is, I think, completely contrary to the ethos of the founding and of Lincoln, and really, I think, certainly of the stated words of the civil rights generation of the 60s. We can quibble about whether they were masking their real intent. I've read arguments that, the colorblinded ideal of the 1960s was never intended seriously. It was a kind of veil over the real agenda to sell it to middle America. Well, I still believe in it, whether it was ever intended seriously or not. And you could just see corporations going in that direction. And I could see where the writing on the wall and just wanted to get out.
I think that was particularly true if you had any knowledge of HR departments. They were ahead of the curve within the corporation, so to speak. And people had discussions in which were fairly frank about who they were going to hire in racial terms and sexual terms, and who they couldn't, because there were already too many such people in the organization. I want to move on very briefly to your first time in government. You worked in the Bush administration, and I wondered what experiences you drew from that, and what's your view of that administration now?
My view of it has gone down, and essentially because my view of the Iraq War has gone down, something I supported in 2003 when I worked there. By around 2007, I had to come to the painful realization that it hadn't worked. I'm a bit. I'm not as hard over about this as other of my friends are today, and that is to say, I'm still willing to concede that in the perspective of 2001 to 2003, the feeling that we needed to do something about the Middle East, hostility coming from the Middle East, the potential for more terrorist attacks, the potential for WMD terrorist attacks, Saddam Hussein's then 12-year record of flouting UN resolutions and behaving like an international outlaw, that it was a much closer call whether to go into Iraq or not. There are some people who say it should have been obvious to everyone that this would be a disaster. I'm more generous than that to the people who supported it. The people to whom I am now ungenerous are the people who, even today, say, no, it was still the right thing to do and it worked out. That seems to me to be crazy. In hindsight, the people who said don't do it were right. And we owe them an apology or whatever. We owe them the acknowledgement that they were right, and those of us who supported it were wrong. So one can't help but judge the Bush administration by its greatest failure, which is the Iraq War. The other thing I could just say about my experience, this is, neither here nor there, but I learned how the government and the national security bureaucracy works from the inside, which was a valuable experience, which helped me when I went back into the Trump administration. Although all the ways in which the government is essentially ungovernable through ordinary politics had gotten significantly worse by the time I got to the Trump administration.
Good, thank you. Now, I'd like to move now on from those other experiences to the fact that to when you first came into public attention in 2016. You published under the pseudonym Publius Decius Mus, an article in the Journal of American Greatness, and that made an enormous impression because it crystallized what a great many other people felt about what has gone wrong in social policy and foreign policy in the United States, but they weren't themselves able to quite articulate and reason through those feelings. Could you tell me here, and obviously we have a multinational audience, what case you were making in that article?
First of all, the Journal of American Greatness was a blog that predated the Flight 93 election, which was an article that sort of grew out of JAG, but was published in the Claremont Review of Books, actually, on the website in September. So JAG, Journal of American Greatness blog, ran from about February to June. We took it down. I kind of thought that I was done writing about the election, and then ended up writing something that became far more famous than anything I had done before. The argument was just that, we talked earlier about the celebration parallax regarding demographic change. And the Democrats have been saying since a popular book came out in 2002 called The Emerging Democratic Majority, that very soon the Republicans will not have any chance to wield national political power because of demographic change and the tip to Democratic majorities in certain states. And I thought, I just took them at their word and looked at their argument and said, these guys are right. This is about to happen. In fact, they thought it was going to happen earlier than it did, but I thought we were right on the cusp of it. I thought that if Hillary won the 2016 election, that would be the end for Republicans. The same way Republicans now, they exist in New York and California, but barely as elected officials. There are millions of Republican voters in New York and California, for instance, but they have absolutely no say over what happens in their state politics. And I saw that potentially, I still think it potentially can happen in the United States, and I warned against it. And that was the negative case. And I made a positive case for Trump, saying, look, our immigration policy has been terrible forever. He wants to try to turn it in the other direction. That's good. Trade policy has been not working for, it works for New York, and it works for San Francisco, but it doesn't work for the rest of the country. Or, it works for blue America. It works for blue elites in the managerial class, tech and banking. It doesn't work for anybody else. And Trump wants to change that. And our foreign policy has obviously been essentially a disaster for 20 years. And he wants to start fixing that. So in addition to the negative case, I saw a positive case for him and made it. And it did make a lot of people mad.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think that article led to two things. The first was you very quickly, in a way instantly, became a significant figure in the pantheon of those conservative writers and thinkers in what I would describe, who adopt a position, what I would call conservative realism, both in domestic and in foreign policy. I wonder if you would agree with that, and particularly what's your view, for example, of the figure James Burnham, who is very much one of the major figures in that tradition?
Yeah, I mean, Burnham was certainly an inspiration for JAG, especially the managerial revolution, which seems to be very highly prophetic about where we found ourselves and who our new elite is and how they rule and how they form the basis of the economy. In terms of realism, I mean, I'm not one of those guys who wants to say, well, I eschew labels, because I think people who always do that as a dodge. But this one has always puzzled me. As I say to my students, shouldn't everybody be a realist? I mean, I know when I'm talking to my students, I say, raise your hand if you're not a realist. Raise your hand if you want to say, my preferred policy or foreign policy is deliberately unrealistic and out of touch. Nobody thinks that, right? So, even the neoconservatives arguing for the democratization of the Middle East in 2002, 2003 believed they were realists. They believed that realistically the use of American power could transform a region in ways beneficial to American interests. Turns out they were wrong, but they thought it could be accomplished. So if realism also means, complete cynicism and acceptance of the status quo, no matter how bad, and denial that change can ever be made by external means, then I'm not a realist.
But in what sense then was Burnham a realist? Not obviously in the technical sense of someone who thinks that the ideas that people embrace in politics or that states adopt as ideologies, he didn't believe, I think, that those things had no influence on their actions. I think he would say they did, but that they weren't always the decisive interest. Realism is accepting that there are factors in foreign policy and in domestic policy where the politician is basically calculating the odds and adopting the policy that is perhaps closest. I
teach Hans Morgenthau to my students, who's the classic foreign policy realist thinker, intellectual of the 20th century. And he has 6 criteria for what it means to be a realist. And I'm not going to run down through them all, but most of them are fairly sensible. Where I disagree or where I think he goes off the rails is one of them is he basically says, and I hope I'm not straw manning him here. I don't intend to. I'm just trying to simplify this from memory, that every decision a state or a statesman makes is based on a calculation of interest and power. And sometimes they miscalculate. They can make mistakes. Doesn't mean they're always right, but that's the lens through which they always see things. And I see that's where I think that's unrealistic. That states and statesmen can sometimes see things through an idealistic lens. They can sometimes do things that they think are purely moral for moral reasons are the right things to do. They can sometimes do things out of a thumatic passion that's irrational. I remember being in grad school, and a famous then professor, still famous but deceased, named Alan Bloom, was at a conference within a political economy conference, and the political economist was saying, no, you're giving you the usual rational calculation. Everybody makes a rational calculation, and whenever in every action they make. And Bloom said something like, "Really? So when a guy, smashes a vase against the wall in anger, how is that a rational calculation?" And the economist said, "Well, all I'm saying is if there's a whole bunch of vases on a shelf and 6 of them are from Pottery Barn and one is this priceless 16th century Ming vase, you'll smash the one from Pottery Barn." And Bloom said something like, "Well, you don't understand Achilles then, because Achilles would go straight for the 16th century Ming vase and smash that first." Bloom is right on this, right? That's what I think Morgenthau misses.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'd like to move on to your book. It's entitled The Stakes. So the obvious question is, what stakes in what game?
The same stakes as 2016, only bigger.
Which are?
Will the Republicans ever have a chance to put together a governing majority again? I think if they lose this election, we're going to see permanent blue state coast-to-coast rule. We're going to see mass amnesties. We've seen recently, too, I don't know, think about the things that 2020 has revealed to us. At first, nobody knew where the politics of the coronavirus were going to shake out. Now it's very clear that if you are a Democrat, a liberal, a Biden supporter, somebody from the coast or whatever, and you want lockdowns and mask mandates, whether they're constitutional, whether they're legislatively enacted or not. You just want the use of state power enforced by fiat according to so-called expert consensus. Very, very in keeping with the way I describe the progressive era. You are all for rioting and mayhem in the streets. Maybe you're not entirely for it, but you have a hard time condemning it. It's no justice, no peace. The famous Maxine Waters line from 1992 LA riots. I don't condone it, but I understand it. Well, the Democrats and their lackeys have endless amounts of understanding for mayhem and seemingly endless patience for it, and just an unwillingness or inability to enforce the law in big cities. So in addition to blue state politics from coast to coast, I think we're going to see a lot more lockdowns, mayhem, and just think all the things that have made 2020 a really intolerable year in many ways. I think the country is going to get worse. I think that it'll also test the ability of the managerial elite and the sort of blue coastal class and their woke left ideology derived from the universities, which I think is in many respects anti-nature and riddled with contradictions. It will test their ability of that vision to govern successfully. I always say don't bet against them. Look how far they've gotten already. Then again, I do. If I'm right, if Aristotle's right, and/or if my interpretation of Aristotle is correct, I don't think the current regime or the current regime that the blue elites want is a thing that can be kept going for very long. I think it's just too inherently riven with contradictions and problems.
Well, let me just then try to define the two sides in this argument. I think we can define the broad conservative coalition in today's politics fairly clearly. It's been around a long time. It's changing its character slightly. You may wish to redefine it somewhat. But I'm particularly interested in your analysis of the forces arrayed against the conservatives on the left of politics, because they seem to control almost all the non-electoral social institutions in the country.
They do. Well, first of all, I do think the coalition has changed. I mean, Trump's coalition is much more working class, middle class, non-college educated, old-fashioned Union Democrat types that used to vote for the Democrats. And Trump is losing, or at least the Republicans are losing, for now, certain slices of the educated electorate that used to vote Republican for issues like tax cuts and deregulation. Now, I shouldn't say losing. Maybe that's a little too strong, because Trump's approval rating with the party right now is sky high. But certainly these elites don't like Trump's agenda on immigration and trade and war. And they want to go back in time to the 1985 Republican agenda and Republican coalition, which I think is foolish and can't possibly win elections. So that said, you're absolutely right that every power center in the United States, really apart from the White House and one or two others, is controlled by the left. And it makes it very difficult, even when you win an election, even when you win a presidential election, it makes it very difficult for you to enact your program in any way when you have essentially no control over all the other power centers in the country. One of the reasons why I find it kind of laughable that the left gets so upset about Trump when I say, you guys are really sore winners. You have almost everything. You must have everything or it's not good enough. I also find it laughable. People right now are talking about, oh, well, Trump is going to use his power to try to stay in office and stage a coup. I said this yesterday to somebody, and I say it now. I need to write it out so that the argument can get more into the bloodstream. Trump does not have the power to stay in office via a coup. The federal government will not follow him. If they think he lost, there's no way he can give an order to the U.S. military or the Secret Service or the Marshal Service or whatever and say, I am now dictator Trump. Follow me or else. They just won't. They will defy his orders and they will force him out of the White House. He cannot possibly become Caesar or Napoleon. He doesn't have the political strength within the institutions to pull that off. So this is just pure projection on the left's part when they say they're worried about this.
As a matter of fact, back in the 1970s, there were a lot of people going around saying that there would be a military coup in Britain. There were two replies, really. How can you have a military coup in the absence of an army? And the second was, look, I don't believe, and people said, we don't believe that the magistrates will follow the orders of a man who's in illegally seized power. And I think that is true in all the English-speaking world, really, although that may be tested soon. Let me just quickly go back to a point you've already made. Namely the emerging democratic majority. As a matter of fact, that was first written about, not by Judith and Teixeira, whose work I admire, but by Peter Brimelow and Ed Rubenstein in National Review about 6 months before the two Democrats. And what strikes me about it is that it has been delayed much longer than I would have thought, and I think you said the same thing. Well, why has that majority taken so long to actually appear? And why was it, in a sense, beaten back this last time?
Well, one reason it's taken so long for the majority to appear is Hispanic citizens do not vote at the rates of other citizens. Now that could change. You could see voter participation go up, although another complicating factor for the emerging, we'll see, I don't know. But right now it's looking like Trump is going to do very well with Hispanics. And, Republicans have traditionally done well with Cubans and perhaps Venezuelans, Hispanic voters who have some direct experience or indirect experience through family with communism, and they do less well with Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and so on. But the Hispanic voters also not particularly enamored of rioting and live, in many cases in cities closer to the rioting. It's one thing, I live in a blue suburb outside of DC, which hasn't been touched by any of this nonsense. And one sees a lot of Black Lives Matters and no justice, no peace signs on the lawn because it's a cost-free way to virtue signal. If you live in a city, rioting, there's no cost-free way to virtue signal about that because the rioting can easily reach your neighborhood. And this is just a long-winded way of saying it's possible Trump will do much better with Hispanics than first. I think he got 28% last time. He's polling in the 40s now. We'll see how that goes. That could further complicate the emerging Democratic majority. But one thing that has delayed it up to now, though, Hispanics do overwhelmingly 60-40 or 2/3, 1/3 vote for Democrats. But they don't vote, at least they don't participate electorally to the degree of their presence in the population, right? And the Democrats have been, trying to remedy this problem for a while. Voter registration drives, get out the vote drives to say, look, if you're X% of the population, but you're only voting at Y% rate, you're not utilizing your full potential influence. That's one reason. The second reason is just that realignment that I talked about earlier, where either Union Democrats decided to flip for Trump, or people who just hadn't voted in a long time in the upper Midwest and in the Rust Belt and elsewhere, because they just thought neither party spoke to them, finally came out and voted for Trump because he really was, in their opinion, and I think rightly, offering something different.
Let me follow up on that. Because we're living through, in the last 6 months, an astounding spread of disorder and anarchy and antinomianism, the expression of extraordinary opinions, which really are accepted by leading figures in the Democratic Party. Now, given that the broad left coalition has taken such strongly left-wing positions, and that it's associated with, indeed it's associating itself with public disorder and political violence on a big scale, why do you think it's managed to retain such widespread support? According to the polls today, still majority support.
50 years of indoctrination in these ideas, I think, has an incredible effect. Now, the elites push these doctrines as a way of covering their privilege. Being for Black Lives Matter and woke rioting, if you're a corporate CEO, a banker, a tech CEO, is a way of deflecting attention from your really obscene wealth and the obscene Gini coefficient, and wealth inequality that's built up into the system. I mean, we have Bourbon levels of inequality in the United States now, and if Aristotle is to be believed, when wealth and privilege inequality builds up to that level, you get extreme discontent from the bottom pointed upward. And if you're at the top, you will be naturally afraid of that and try to find ways. There are two ways you can respond to that. One is, let's try to do something to reduce this inequality. Our elites have decided that they don't want to go down that path. Instead, what they say, let's try to deflect attention. And that's what they've been doing. And propaganda is the key means they have of keeping this coalition together, as I explained at some length in chapter 3 of the book. And I think the propaganda is insane and ham-fisted and transparently stupid. That doesn't mean it is ineffective. It's been extremely effective. And what they do to keep their coalition together is whip up resentments. They keep people angry and on edge. And that, I think, is an unstable, it works until it doesn't. Right now, clearly it's working. The coalition is solid. There's a lot of anti-Trump sentiment out there. They can use that anti-Trump sentiment out there to hold their coalition together. But at a certain point, if you can't deliver concrete things for people, merely stoking resentments will not be enough, and it will fail. I just don't know when that point is.
Let me turn from the situation to the president, because the president is a complicated figure from outside as well as inside. We all know the kind of faults of character he seems to have, his impulsiveness, that kind of thing. But then there are other factors. For example, if you were to talk to a strong supporter in the past, Ann Coulter, she would express strong disappointment with what he's actually done over immigration, namely not a great deal. And yet he manages, despite these failures of policy, he manages to maintain a very strong grip on a significant section of the American population. How much is he the explanation for the failure of the left to finally have its revolution, and how much is it the situation?
Unfortunately, he is a lot of the reason. And I say unfortunately because what I would like to see for politics to get better in America is Trumpists to succeed Trump. In other words, I want more, let's say he wins. He still only gets 4 more years. We need more people to come up behind him who share his outlook and his program. And what makes me nervous is that I hope his personal appeal, which is very strong and probably not replicable. There's not going to be another Trump come along and have the same exact, or even close to the same personal appeal to his voters that Trump has had. If this all comes down to personality, we have a problem, because I don't think he's replicable. So I'd like to see people follow him who share his program, but then I also want to see, that is to say, politicians follow him who share his program. But if that's going to work, people are going to have to follow those people because of the program and not just because they love Trump personally. And if it's mostly the latter, then populism has a problem and perhaps a short shelf life.
Well, if you had complete control of the Republican campaign, which is not very likely, what would you do? Which issues would you emphasize? Which issues would you discard? How would you appeal to the coalition that you would hope to create?
Now I would emphasize the virus and the riots. I'd be aggressive about going out. Well, I'd be carefully aggressive about going after the rioters. I think part of what's happening is Democrats and the left and the media are trying to trick or tempt Trump to go in force and precipitate some kind of Kent State type event that they can then use to say this is fascism and look at this evil man steamrolling our rights and getting people in the streets killed. And he's wisely refrained from that. I do think there's more that the Justice Department could do in targeting financing and targeting leaders and arresting leaders and things like that maybe they could do. I would be more forthright, and I think I'd be even more anti-lockdown than Trump has been. But I would also try to make the case. The Democrats are trying to make this all about, well, the experts say. Well, first of all, the experts are confused. They're giving you contradictory messaging about COVID constantly. There's no consensus. But more fundamentally, this is not a country that is ruled by experts. Supposedly, it's a democracy. It's a deliberative. We have a deliberative government where the experts can give us their best opinion. Here's what we think. Here's what we recommend. But we get to decide the extent to which we want to close the economy, force people to wear masks, say you can't go outside, and so on. We don't just cede that entirely to so-called experts, in which case we don't rule ourselves anymore. And I'd like to see that case made a little bit more forcefully. And I bet it would have some salience, and people would follow.
Let me ask you a question which is, in a sense, an attempt to clear up a mystery. Why do you think that, although it's evident to you, and I think it was to me, that immigration was a major factor and it's a major reason for the development, it's a major motive power behind the emerging Democratic majority, why do you think that the Republican leadership was extraordinarily cohesive and united in resisting again and again any attempt to reduce immigration on the one hand, or even to raise it as an issue?
Because their donor class likes immigration for two reasons. One is it's a source of cheap labor and it keeps wages down. And two is, again, it helps deflect from wealth concentration. It allows the donor class, it allows CEOs and big business and the people with power and money to preen about their virtue. Well, I'm pro-immigrant, It's human nature to be resentful for those who have more than you have, to be resentful of those who are rich and in power and so on. And one way you deflect that resentment is by virtue signaling about how woke and how liberal you are and how, you're on the right side of these issues. I call it in a piece that I wrote a few years ago called San Francisco Values, I used the term socio-intellectual money laundering. This is how these guys legitimize their wealth and privilege. But then that points to the other reason, which is Republicans are just Republicans feel that they need to do that too. That they're terrified of being called racist. They need to constantly make gestures to elite opinion that that they're good, that they can't be bad people because they're for open immigration. And yes, we're conservative, but we're compassionate. We're not bad guys. We're not that kind of conservative. We're good guys because we believe in open borders. And for the ruling class, it's let's say preening, but for the Republican politicians, it's pleading. Please don't hate me. Don't be mean to me. Don't think ill of me. And as evidence that I'm okay, I will praise open borders and the beauty and majesty of immigration.
Let me ask two final questions that take us beyond November. Let's assume that Donald Trump wins in November and that the GOP retains control of at least the US Senate. As you've pointed out, as we've agreed, almost all the other institutions of society will remain under the control of the broad Democratic left. If that remains the case, then one time or another, the left will win a decisive election and everything will move in that direction. So the question then becomes, how does a conservative electoral majority obtain the reform of social, cultural, institutional and educational institutions, including the media, so as to ensure that two-party democracy remains alive and kicking from both directions?
Well, there's two possibilities. One is once the left gets total power, they go too far, and or the contradictions in their program become even evident to the voters, and the voters say, all right, we need a corrective and we have to go back. That's assuming the system still works, which I have my doubts if that's possible, but it is. I think it is possible. I have my doubts as to how likely that is. Let's put it that way. The second is they get total power and they just push the pedal to the floor and they break the system. And there's no alternative. The consensus, which I think is already fragile, collapses. And out of necessity, a new kind of political consensus or new form of political order must arise. I think, honestly, the left, my interpretation of the left in its current dispensation and mood is that if they have their way, they will take us all the way off the cliff before they stop and moderate. And I don't say that with any great pleasure. I'm not looking forward to it, should it happen. But that's the way I read them now, unfortunately.
So where does that leave us in terms of civil liberties? Will it still be possible to have the kind of debates that are still possible in Western democratic societies, and particularly in America? Are we going to find that the kind of opinions that you've been expressing today simply either are outlawed or more likely can find no outlet of a respectable kind?
They can, nothing is permanent, but I think for as long as they have power, yes, they will do everything they can to suppress these kinds of opinions. But suppression is a short-term, as the Soviets found out, it depends on what you mean by short-term. 70 years is a long time, but in the span of human history, it's not really that long. The czars ruled for far longer than 70 years. When you get to the point where you have to suppress, where you have to censor and persecute, you've already, in a sense, you've already lost, right? You've won because you control all the institutions and you have the instruments of power to persecute. So in that sense, you've won. But if you were really winning, you wouldn't need to do this. And it's not a long-term solution. But I think they will try it, and they will do it for as long as they can do it. And then the question becomes, how long can they do it before either there's a major revolt or reaction and or their decrepit system breaks?
Michael, I'm English. I'm not an American. But someone who's been living on and off in America since 1979, I was always impressed by the degree to which a self-conscious affirmation of the American Constitution and its tradition, and its pantheon of heroes, the Founding Fathers, Lincoln and others, was a living tradition in America in a way that you couldn't say, for example, the same thing was true about the Glorious Revolution in Britain, which, by the way, when it was celebrated as 300 years of Anglo-Dutch friendship, which does not seem to me to be quite the story there. So given that, if I'm right about that, isn't the fact that millions of Americans have, so to speak, absorbed this constitutional tradition in their bones almost, isn't that going to be a tremendously important factor of resistance to the kind of changes that you've been worrying about?
Yes, one hopes. A country born in revolution, one presumes, has a revolutionary spirit that, does not die easily. But there are two reasons to doubt or at least worry. One is the demographic change means we've taken in lots of people that maybe don't have that same revolutionary spirit. I think it's, one of the more ridiculous things that's happened in the immigration quote unquote debate is this notion that we can take in anyone from anywhere, and as soon as they step foot off the plane, they're just as American as George Washington. That's absurd. No political philosopher believed that. The traditions, the opinions, the habits of the country you emerge from and the people you emerge from exert a powerful pull over everyone. And it could be that this demographically new America is less inclined to that rebellious revolutionary spirit. But it also could be that even the people who have the revolutionary spirit or who had it in their tradition have gotten soft, for lack of a better term. I was talking about this. I was just in Hillsdale the last couple of days. This is my college where I teach in Michigan, and speaking to some professors, and we were talking about letters between Hamilton and Jefferson. Everybody who knows American history knows they were bitter opponents, disagreed about many things, but they both had a concern about, well, what happens if this experiment succeeds and we get rich and the country gets rich? They look to Europe and they say, when people's, and to history, when peoples get rich and powerful and successful, they get soft and complacent. And maybe that spirit declines. So, you know, part of me wonders and is a little concerned, because I thought, you know, a really rebellious American people would have said, oh no, the hell with the lockdowns and the mask mandates a long time ago. They're going along with it for now, maybe not forever. It's enough to give you pause. So, you know, in every question you've answered, I have basically said, I don't know. I've just given you reasons for thinking the one thing and thinking the other thing. But because I don't know.
Well, thank you. Obviously, neither of us can foretell the future, but I think you've given us all of the kind of guideposts to work out which way we should be going and which way we perhaps are not going. I want to thank you very much. You've given very generously of your time. I think it's been, for me at least, a fascinating conversation. I think for our viewers in due course as well. Michael, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.